Human found an alien girl shivering in the ruins, but what she feared was not the night itself. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Ethan Walker had spent years of his life traveling between the stars, but nothing had prepared him for this. The cold, desolate ruins of the abandoned city stretched before him, a haunting reminder of what was lost to time. It was the dead of night, and a fierce wind whipped through the debris, carrying with it the sharp scent of ice and forgotten history. His boots crunched against the frost-covered ground, his breath forming clouds of mist in the frigid air. As he ventured further into the ruins, his flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls of crumbling buildings. It was then that he saw her. At first, she appeared as nothing more than a silhouette, her thin form huddled in a corner of the collapsed structure, shivering uncontrollably. The faintest glow of her skin illuminated the surroundings, a soft, almost ethereal shade of blue, a stark contrast to the grayness of the ruined city. Her violet eyes were wide with fear, and her body trembled as if the very bones inside her were frozen. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his heart racing. He had heard stories of the aliens that inhabited this sector, but he had never encountered one up close, let alone in such a vulnerable state. As he approached, his military training kicked in. He kept his distance, assessing the situation carefully. She didn't move when he drew closer, her eyes fixed on him, her expression a mixture of terror and desperation. "Hey," he called softly, crouching down a few feet away from her, his voice steady but laced with concern. "You're safe now. I won't hurt you." The alien girl's breathing was shallow, her fear palpable in the cold air. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus on him, as though she didn't fully trust the presence of another being. Ethan had seen enough to know when someone was too frightened to speak. He didn't push. Instead, he slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a thermal blanket, extending it toward her. "This will help keep you warm," he said, his voice gentle. But the alien girl's reaction was far from what he expected. She didn't reach for the blanket. Instead, she recoiled slightly, her eyes wide with something far deeper than fear. For a brief moment, Ethan wondered if she was afraid of the night itself. But then she whispered something in a language he couldn't understand, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Ethan furrowed his brow, leaning in closer, his curiosity piqued. It wasn't the cold that frightened her. It was something else, something far darker. "What is it?" he asked, more to himself than to her. But the alien girl only shook her head, her hands trembling at her sides. Whatever it was, she feared it more than the frozen night. Ethan felt a pang of unease gnaw at him. There was more to this than he could see. He had to find out what it was, before it was too late. The wind howled as Ethan sat down in front of the alien girl, still shivering in the corner of the ruined structure. The cold had clearly taken its toll on her, but there was something deeper in her eyes, something that told him the night's chill wasn't the source of her fear. The alien girl looked at him, her gaze sharp, yet full of uncertainty. Her skin, an ethereal shade of blue, glowed faintly in the dim light, and her silver-white hair cascaded around her shoulders. Ethan could tell she was exhausted, her body barely able to hold itself upright. The emotional strain of the situation was too much for her to handle. Ethan spoke softly, keeping his tone calm. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." She didn't respond immediately, her eyes still locked on him, searching for something he couldn't understand. Ethan's military training told him to be patient. He had dealt with many dangerous situations, but this one felt different. She wasn't simply frightened, she was haunted by something, a fear so deep that it overshadowed everything else. Ethan reached into his pack once more, this time pulling out a small food ration. "You need something to eat," he said, holding it out in front of her. The alien girl stared at the ration for a long moment before slowly, cautiously, reaching out to take it. Her hands were shaking as she held the food, but her gaze never left Ethan's face. She hesitated, as though weighing something in her mind. Ethan could see the inner conflict playing out behind her eyes. "You're safe here," he reassured her. Nothing's going to hurt you. Still, she didn't eat. Instead, she clutched the ration tightly, her eyes darting around the ruined structure as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Ethan frowned. Something wasn't right. The alien girl's fear wasn't just about her immediate surroundings. Whatever haunted her was much bigger than the cold or the desolation of the ruins. Ethan had no way of knowing what it was, but he had to find out. He wasn't going to leave her alone, not when she needed him the most. "What is it you're afraid of?" he asked gently, his voice soft but insistent. The girl's violet eyes widened, her body stiffening as if she had just heard something she wasn't supposed to. Her mouth opened as though she was about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she swallowed hard, her breath shallow. "It's not the night," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "It's them. They're coming for me." Ethan's heart raced. Who was she talking about? He had no idea, but the fear in her voice was undeniable. Ethan shifted closer, careful not to alarm her further. "Who's coming for you? Are they the reason you're here?" The alien girl shook her head, her lips trembling as she fought to keep her composure. "No, they're not from here," she said, her voice breaking. "But they'll find me. They always do." Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. He had to keep her safe, but he didn't even know what they were running from. "Listen to me," Ethan said firmly, taking a step closer, his voice steady. "I don't care who's coming. I'm not leaving you. You're not alone." The alien girl looked at him, her eyes full of doubt, but there was a flicker of something else, hope. She wasn't used to being helped. She wasn't used to someone caring. But here he was, a human, offering his protection in the middle of this desolate wasteland. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her after all. The air was still, the silence of the ruined city almost unbearable. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon, keeping his senses sharp, but the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind against the shattered remains of buildings. The alien girl, Ariella, was still clutching the food ration in her hands, but her eyes were no longer filled with the same intense fear they had held earlier. For the first time since he had found her, she was beginning to relax, just a little. Ethan took a deep breath and sat down next to her, making sure to keep some distance, respecting the quiet space she seemed to need. They didn't speak for a while, and Ethan let the silence settle between them, giving her time to think, to process. He could tell she wasn't used to anyone showing her kindness. He could see it in the way she watched him from the corner of her eye, as though waiting for the moment when he would disappear like the others. After a while, Ariella spoke again, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can hide," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she held the ration. Ethan turned his head to face her, his heart aching at the raw vulnerability in her voice. "You're safe here for now," he said, trying to reassure her. "Whoever is after you won't find us here. Not if we keep our heads down." Ariella shook her head, the faintest flicker of sadness crossing her face. "It's not that simple," she replied. "I'm not hiding from just anyone. I'm hiding from my own kind." Ethan blinked, surprised by her words. "Your own kind?" he asked, his voice soft with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Ariella's gaze dropped to the ground, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the ration she still held. "I was born to be a warrior," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of something long buried. "But I failed. I was too weak. I couldn't protect my people. I couldn't even protect myself." She paused for a long moment, as if gathering the strength to say what came next. "So, they abandoned me. Left me to die." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy. For her, he had known what it was like to be left behind, to be told you weren't good enough. But this was something else entirely. Ariella wasn't just abandoned. She had been cast out by her own people. The thought of that stirred something inside him. "That's terrible," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "No one should ever be treated like that, no matter what." Ariella looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to understand the sincerity in his words. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her tone tinged with bitterness. "You don't know what it's like to be so alone." Ethan's expression softened, and for a moment, he simply stared at her, his heart heavy with empathy. "I may not know exactly what it's like," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "But I do know what it's like to be left behind, to feel like you don't matter. And that's something no one should ever go through. No one should ever have to feel like they're alone." Ariella's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she lowered her gaze again. I've lost everything, she murmured. My family, my friends, my honor. I don't know how to go on. Ethan felt a surge of determination inside him. He couldn't let her fall into despair. He wouldn't let her. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice low but strong. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together. Ariella looked at him, her expression softening just a little. For the first time since he had found her, Ethan saw a spark of hope in her eyes, the faintest glimmer that maybe, just maybe, she could start to believe in the possibility of something better. The silence returned for a while, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was calm, like the quiet before a storm. Ethan sat beside her, his heart racing slightly, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult. But as long as he was there, he knew they could face whatever came next, together. The night passed slowly, the wind howling outside, but inside the ruins, a strange calm had settled over Ethan and Ariella. He could still hear the faint rustling of debris shifting in the distance, but it felt distant, like the world outside no longer mattered. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to relax, but his thoughts were never far from the alien girl sitting beside him. She had barely touched the food ration he had offered her, but the small piece of trust he had seen in her eyes was enough to give him hope. He had known she was broken, but there was something about her strength, buried deep under the layers of fear and pain, that stirred something inside him. Ariella hadn't said much since their conversation, but Ethan could feel her starting to open up, even if just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The warmth of the fire they had managed to start with the limited supplies they had, combined with the small silence between them, made Ethan feel the weight of their shared isolation. He didn't know how long it would take for Ariella to truly trust him, but he was determined to be there for her. The next morning, the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the ruined building, casting a pale glow over the dusty floors. Ethan stretched his limbs, his body stiff from the uncomfortable night, and stood up slowly, careful not to disturb Ariella. She was still sitting where he had left her, her eyes closed, but she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was steady, but her body was still tense, as though she was ready to jump at any sound. Ethan moved quietly, checking the perimeter for any signs of danger. He hadn't heard anything last night, but that didn't mean they were safe. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard by whoever or whatever was chasing her. He made his way back to her, crouching down in front of her again. Ariella's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, the same wariness still present in her gaze. Ethan smiled softly, trying to put her at ease. "Morning," he said quietly. She didn't respond at first, but after a long moment, she nodded slightly. "Morning," she said, her voice low but steady. Ethan offered her a small ration of food, which she hesitated to take at first. But after a brief pause, she accepted it, her hands trembling slightly as she held it. He watched her carefully, waiting for her to say something, anything. When she didn't, he decided to break the silence. "We need to keep moving," he said. "I'm not sure how long we can stay here. Whoever's after you might be closer than we think." Ariella's eyes flickered to the horizon, her expression clouding over with worry. "I can't keep running," she said quietly. "I've been running my whole life." Ethan crouched down beside her, his voice gentle. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. "I'm here. I'll protect you. We can figure this out together." Ariella looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to decide if she could believe him. Finally, she lowered her gaze and nodded, just barely. "All right," she whispered. "But we need to find the others. I can't do this alone." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had no idea who the others were, but he wasn't about to let her face them alone. "Then we'll find them," he said. "We'll stick together. You're not alone, Ariella. Not anymore." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but they were true. He couldn't imagine leaving her behind. As they prepared to leave the ruins, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was just beginning. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Ethan could feel the shift in the air as he and Ariella stepped out of the ruins. The quiet tension from before had begun to ease, though both knew they couldn't relax just yet. The wind was still biting, the cold sharp against their skin, but it didn't seem to matter as much now. Ariella, though still cautious, had begun to trust him in small, subtle ways. They moved through the desolate landscape together, step by step, their surroundings a constant reminder of the devastation that had once been a thriving civilization. As they walked, Ethan kept his eyes peeled for any signs of danger, but his mind was more focused on Ariella. There was still so much she wasn't telling him, and the more he got to know her, the more he realized how deep the fear ran. "So, who are the others you're looking for?" Ethan asked as they made their way across the rocky terrain, his voice steady and calm. Ariella hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "They're from my clan. The ones who cast me out." Ethan could hear the bitterness in her tone. "I thought you said they left you to die." Ariella's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and pain. "They didn't care what happened to me. They just didn't want me to be a burden to them anymore." Ethan stopped walking for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had seen enough of the world to know that betrayal came in many forms, but this was something different. Ariella had been abandoned by the very people she was born to protect. It made no sense. I'm sorry," Ethan said softly, looking at her. "But if they're out there, we'll find them. Together." Ariella nodded, her gaze distant. "I don't know if I want to find them," she admitted. "They don't see me as one of them anymore. They never did." Ethan could hear the pain in her voice, and it made him want to promise her that things would be different, that she would never have to feel that way again. But he knew better than to make empty promises. "You don't need them to prove your worth," he said instead, his voice steady. "You're more than what they think of you." Ariella didn't respond right away, but he could feel her eyes on him, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. After a moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I believe that." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. "Then let me show you." He wasn't sure where the words came from, but something in him knew that he needed to help her see what he saw. The woman in front of him wasn't broken. She wasn't weak. She was strong. He could see it in the way she held herself, even in the face of everything she had been through. She was a survivor. Ariella was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, just a little, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge the truth in his words. She didn't say anything, but Ethan could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Perhaps hope, perhaps doubt. But something had shifted. They continued on, the cold wind biting at their faces, but the world seemed a little less empty now. As they made their way through the barren landscape, Ethan knew they had a long road ahead of them. But for the first time since he had met Ariella, he felt like they were walking it together. And that made all the difference. The days that followed were a slow, deliberate march forward. Ethan and Ariella continued their journey across the barren land, the vast emptiness stretching out before them, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Each step was heavy, but as the days passed, Ariella began to show more of herself. She wasn't as withdrawn as she had been at first, though there were moments when she would retreat into herself, her eyes distant as though trapped in memories she couldn't escape. Ethan, however, stayed close, always ready with a word of encouragement or a silent gesture, letting her know that he was there for her. As they traveled, they came upon small signs of life, an old, abandoned settlement here, a wrecked transport vehicle there, but nothing that offered the answers they were looking for. No trace of the others Ariella spoke of. Despite the quiet, Ariella's fear never fully dissipated. She never spoke much about her past or the people who had cast her out, but Ethan could tell the scars ran deep. One evening, as they camped beneath a sky full of stars, Ariella finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They called me weak," she said, her words hanging heavy in the air. "I wasn't strong enough to protect them, to lead them like I was meant to." Ethan glanced at her, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. "But you survived," he said gently. "And that's what matters. You're strong. You're here." Ariella's gaze was distant, lost in thoughts only she could understand. "Surviving isn't enough," she murmured. "I failed them, Ethan. I failed my people." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't fail anyone. Sometimes, the hardest thing is knowing when to walk away from what's broken. You're still here because you chose to keep going. That takes real strength." Ariella turned her head to look at him, her violet eyes searching his face. She said nothing for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, softer. "What if I'm not strong enough to keep going? What if I can't find my people, Or even if I do, what? If they don't want me anymore? Ethan felt his heart twist at her words. The vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide finally surfacing. He moved closer to her, making sure she could feel his presence without feeling overwhelmed. I'm not going anywhere, Ariella, he said, his voice firm but kind. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone. For a brief moment, she met his gaze, and in her eyes, Ethan saw something he hadn't seen before: hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Ariella slowly nodded, and for the first time in days, she gave him a faint smile. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. Ethan smiled back, relieved to see her opening up, even if just a little. We'll find a way, Ariella. Together. The fire crackled softly between them as the night deepened, and for the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel so empty. They were two people, two survivors, caught in a world that had forgotten them. But for the first time, they weren't alone. They had each other. And that, Ethan thought, was enough to keep moving forward. The days continued to blur together as Ethan and Ariella moved forward, crossing vast stretches of barren landscape with no sign of civilization in sight. The cold wind still whipped through the empty plains, but it no longer felt as overwhelming. They had become accustomed to the silence, to the solitude that surrounded them. Ariella had grown quieter, more introspective, but Ethan could tell she was starting to process the events that had shaped her life. He had never imagined the weight of her past, how her people had cast her aside, how she had failed to live up to their expectations. Yet, in the time they had spent together, he had seen a different side of her, a side that was strong, resilient, and capable of hope. The journey was far from over, and they had no clear destination in mind, but the shared space between them had shifted. It was no longer just survival. They were building something more: trust, companionship, understanding. One morning, after another long day of travel, they found a small cave hidden in the side of a rocky hill. It wasn't much, but it was shelter from the cold and the wind. As they set up camp inside the cave, Ariella sat down on a flat rock, staring out at the horizon. Ethan watched her for a moment, sensing the conflict still lingering inside her. You okay? He asked, sitting down beside her. Ariella nodded slowly, but her expression was distant. I'm fine, she said quietly, but Ethan could see the sadness in her eyes. I never thought I'd be here. With you. Ethan frowned, not fully understanding her words. What do you mean? Ariella turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his face, as though trying to gauge if he could understand. I never thought anyone would care, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Not after everything that happened. After what I lost. Ethan felt a pang in his chest at the raw vulnerability in her voice. You're not alone, he said softly, his voice firm but kind. You have me, and I'm not going anywhere. Ariella's gaze softened, but she didn't respond right away. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the crackling of their small fire the only sound between them. Ethan knew Ariella wasn't used to this kind of comfort. She wasn't used to having someone by her side, someone who didn't expect anything in return. And maybe that was what made it so difficult for her to trust. You've been through so much, Ethan continued, his voice gentle but sincere. But I'm here, and I'm not going to leave you, no matter what. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Ariella looked down at the ground for a moment. Then slowly, almost hesitantly, she nodded. I don't know how to stop running, she said quietly, almost as if she were talking to herself. I've been running from everything for so long. I don't know how to stay still. Ethan's heart went out to her. He couldn't begin to imagine the fear that had driven her, the pain that had pushed her to hide from the world. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her run anymore. Not alone. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice filled with determination. One step at a time. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and I always will be. Ariella finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Ethan felt a deep sense of connection, a bond that had formed over the past few days, forged through the shared silence and the quiet moments of understanding. Ariella didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. It was the first time she truly allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. They sat together in the cave, the night stretching out before them. And for the first time in a long while, the world outside felt a little less cold, a little less empty. They didn't know what the future held, but they were no longer facing it alone. The following days felt both long and short, the weight of time dragging on yet slipping by too quickly. As they traveled further through the barren landscape, Ariella had become quieter, more introspective, and though Ethan could tell she was beginning to process things, he could also sense the emotional walls she had built around herself. There were moments when she would speak about her past, but they were fleeting, as if she was unsure whether she was ready to face it fully. And Ethan understood that. He knew better than to push her too hard. Their journey continued, their steps slow but steady, as the world around them remained unchanged, vast, desolate, and unforgiving. But something between them had shifted. Ariella was beginning to trust him in small, subtle ways, and that gave Ethan hope. One evening, as they made camp by the side of a small, dried-up riverbed, Ariella sat by the fire, her eyes distant. Ethan watched her, sensing that tonight might be the night she finally spoke more about what she had left behind. As the fire crackled between them, he took a deep breath and decided to break the silence. "You've been quiet," he said softly. Ariella looked up at him, her violet eyes meeting his. She didn't speak right away, but after a long moment, she set her gaze back on the fire. "I'm just tired," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know," he said gently. "It's been a long road for both of us." She glanced at him again, a flicker of something in her eyes. "I don't know how to keep going," she admitted, her voice wavering slightly. "I feel like I've already lost everything." Ethan didn't respond right away. He knew better than to offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he simply sat beside her, the quiet of the night surrounding them. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fire and the distant howling wind. After a long while, Ariella spoke again, her words barely a whisper. "They said I was weak," she murmured. "I wasn't strong enough to lead them, to protect them." Ethan's heart ached at the pain in her voice. "You're not weak," he said firmly, his voice steady. "You've been through more than most people ever will, and you're still standing." Ariella didn't say anything, but she looked at him again, her expression softening just slightly. "I don't know if I believe that," she said quietly, her voice full of doubt. Ethan turned to face her, his gaze meeting hers. "You don't have to believe it right now," he said, his voice gentle. "But I believe in you, and I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to do this alone." Ariella's lips trembled slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she looked at the fire for a long moment, the weight of her thoughts clear in the way her shoulders slumped. The silence stretched between them again, but this time, it wasn't as heavy. It was a silence filled with understanding, with something that had shifted in the air. As the fire burned down to embers, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. They were still alone, still wandering through a world that had forgotten them, but somehow, it didn't feel quite as empty as it had before. They had each other, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. As they sat there, watching the last of the fire fade into the night, Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But with Ariella by his side, he felt like they could face whatever came next. Together, the days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and quiet moments. As Ethan and Ariella traveled further into the unknown, a fragile sense of camaraderie grew between them. Their days were spent walking across desolate landscapes, and at night, they would find shelter wherever they could. Ariella had opened up more than she ever had before, and though her fears still lingered, Ethan could sense a change in her. She wasn't the same person who had first stumbled into his life in those ruins. She had become stronger, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she was beginning to trust in something beyond survival. One morning, as they walked through a narrow valley, Ariella stopped suddenly, her gaze focused on something in the distance. Ethan followed her eyes and saw nothing but the barren expanse of rock and sand stretching ahead of them. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. Ariella didn't answer immediately, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel them," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the horizon. "They're close." Ethan's heart quickened. He had heard her speak of the ones who had abandoned her, but he had never fully understood what kind of threat they posed. The fear in her voice now, though, told him everything he needed to know. "We can't stay here," he said, his mind racing. "We need to keep moving. Stay close to me." Ariella's gaze shifted from the horizon to him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was no fear in her expression now, only resolve. "I'm not afraid of them," she said quietly, "but I don't want to face them alone." Ethan gave her a reassuring nod, knowing that this was the moment they had been preparing for. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. As they continued their journey, the tension between them grew, but so did the unspoken bond that had formed. Ariella no longer seemed like the lost soul who had stumbled into his life, looking for a way out. She was beginning to find her own path, and though Ethan wasn't sure where that would lead them, he knew he would follow her. They didn't speak much in the days that followed, each lost in their thoughts, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual respect for the journey they had taken together. As the sun began to set one evening, casting a warm orange glow across the landscape, Ariella stopped again, her eyes scanning the distance. This time, Ethan didn't ask. He simply stood beside her, waiting. After a moment, Ariella turned to him, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, a quiet confidence. "I think I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. Ethan looked at her, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Ready for what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Ariella smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in days. "Ready to stop running," she said softly. In that moment, Ethan realized that she had found something within herself that she had been searching for all along. It wasn't just survival anymore. She had found the strength to face her past, to move forward, and to trust in something more than just getting by. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but as they stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it as equals. No longer running. No longer alone.